The first thing that we're going to do is create the Crime Data Mart. And so we have the SQL files that are available for download from Canvas. And we'll take a brief look at each of those files. Once we create the Crime Data Mart, then we'll go ahead and build the SSIS package. We'll build the workflows that import the data into the staging, and then we'll import the data, work with the staging data, and import it into the dimensions, and then finally into the fact table. So the first thing let's do is create the Crime Data Mart. So I've got SQL Server opened right now, and I have no databases. This is a fresh instance of SQL Server 2017. I have the scripts prepared to create the data mart, and so I'm going to first open the staging, the script that creates the staging table. And remember what a staging table does. A staging table's purpose is to bring in the data from the data source exactly the way that we have it, let's say, in a tabular format from a CSV. But we add some additional columns that allows us to work with the staging table to create our dimensions and ultimately populate our fact table. Now, this script is using a database called Crime. So I need to first create that database, and I'll just do that with the default settings in this instance. So I'm going to create a new database, and I'm going to call it Crime and say OK. The next thing, once the database is created, notice that when I create this very first table to hold the staging data, it has a schema called Crime. So schemas are containers for objects like tables. So we're going to create a, for instance, in this case, this script says create table crime.source data staging. So source data staging is the name of the table, and it's going to be inside the container or the schema Crime. So to create this container schema, I go under security, under Crime, the database, and security underneath the database. So the schema resides underneath the layer of the database. So right now, these are the existing schemas I have that get created when a new database gets created in my instance. So I can just right click on schemas and say new schema, and we're going to call this Crime and say OK. So now I have a Crime schema in my Crime database. So now this script will be able to execute. And in Data Mart Design, we always, it's just a good practice to create a primary key column in all of the tables that we're working at, because in Data Mart Design we typically create our own surrogate key system because we don't necessarily trust or need to rely upon the source data identity from whatever system we're importing the data from. We don't want to rely on that as being our primary key for our data mart. So you'll see here I have the source underscore staging ID. It's an integer value. I identify it here as an identity column, and it's going to increment by 1, starting with 1 as data is imported into this table. And then down below you see here that we create a primary key on right here, a primary key on the source staging ID, and so we're going to cluster that right there on that column. So I'm going to change right here Crime, but of course it would do that if by this command here. The only reason why this is in red at first was because it didn't see right here in the drop down, but once I change that, notice that this is no longer red. Sometimes Visual Studio will not refresh and it will still not recognize certain objects, but in this case it did. So if I click execute, if we have command completes successfully. Then we come over here and we can right click on tables, and we will see that under tables we have the crime data source staging table. So we're finished with that, and let's continue to create another table in our data mart. So we're going to open up the next file, and we're going to make the year dimension. Now typically if you have a data mart that has a hierarchy, I don't recommend that you add any foreign key constraints in the beginning of your design until you are sure that your data will import as expected. So during the development, don't add the foreign key constraints if you have any, which in this data mart design we do. And I know that this data model will work, so I'm going to go ahead and add foreign key constraints as I design these tables. So you typically, if you did have foreign key constraints, you would want to create the tables from the outermost or the peripheral of the key constraints and work inward towards the fact table. So in this case, I'm creating a dimension and I'm calling it dem year, and it's stored inside the crime schema. And it just had, remember, each table, as I said, in Data Mart Design, it's best practice to create your own surrogate identity system, your own primary column. And so I'm just creating the year, and then I have another field called the Chinese New Year. And then I create the primary key down here on the year ID. So I'm just going to execute that. And I'll just pause for just a minute, and let's just take a look at the source data. And so just remind ourselves of what we're building a data mart from. So here, looking at the crime data, I've got a row here that is the source identity column from the source system. We have state, city, year, population. We identified these three columns here as dimensions in previous training video examples. The population is measurable, and the rest of these columns are measurable, and so therefore they become part of the fact table. So we have some dimensions, we have a hierarchy, so we have the city-state hierarchy that we're going to design, and then we have the year dimension by itself, and then all of our measurable data in the fact table. So this is just a reminder of what our data looks like. I'm going to close that CSV and go back to our design. So I'm going to refresh. Since we successfully created that, I'm going to right click on our tables and hit refresh, and you will see that now we have the year dimension. I'm going to close this script so I remember what we've done. So there's our column, and notice that the primary key column was established on the year ID. Okay, and it doesn't allow nulls. So let's create our next. So file, open, file. And let's look at creating the state table first. Let's take a look at that create script. And this one right here, since it's on the periphery of the hierarchy, meaning it's the furthest away in the hierarchy from the fact table, and you'll see that here in a moment when I do a diagram of our design, we're going to create a table, a dimension that stores all of the unique states in our data set. So it's going to include an ID column, an identity column, and the name of the state. And we're going to establish a primary key on the state ID. So there we go. Close. And again, I like to stress until you get used to things, just refresh. And as you build your data marts, just take a look and observe what you've done little by little. So there we go. Next, we'll create the city dimension, which is a hierarchy from the state. So every city in the US has a state. And so we know that there is one state is associated with many cities. And you can also have a state in, or excuse me, a city that has the same name in multiple states. So you'll see how we handle that here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and open up the city dimension. There go. And let's take a look at what we're doing here. Well, first of all, when we create this table called Dem City, we have our identity column. As I said, again, this is a surrogate ID. We're just creating our own identity column. And here you see we have the name of the city, but we also have the state ID in this, because what we're going to do is establish a foreign key constraint right here to state ID inside of the state dimension. And so again, I can't stress enough, you don't typically create foreign key constraints early on in your design of your data mart until you know that your data is stable and you truly understand that there is a foreign key constraint that would not break when you import your data. Now, many enterprise data marts often don't use foreign key constraints because there is a potential for a problem. So professionally, it's not necessarily needed to have a foreign key constraint in a table, but in this case, we're going to go ahead and show that as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this. And notice that we have right here, let's just see what happened, and I had that highlighted, so whoops. Execute that again, and it completed successfully. So it just failed a minute ago because I had this highlighted, and I guess that's an important learning point, that when you use Management Studio and you execute, if you have code that's highlighted, it only executes just that code. So that was an important learning point, that you could make a similar mistake. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to refresh my tables. And you can see now that we have the city, the state, the year, and the staging table. So the only thing we haven't completed is the fact table. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open up that script. And here we've got the fact table right here, crime, fact, crime. And so let's take a look. We've got in our fact table, we have the identities that we're going to build relationships to. So we're going to relate the fact table to the city dimension and the year dimension. And there's a hierarchy, remember, from the city out to the state. And we'll see how that works in just a minute. And then all of the measurable data we have below there in integer columns. And then down below, we're creating our foreign key constraints. So for instance, from the fact table, we're creating a foreign key constraint of the city ID to the city dimension on the city ID. We're also creating a foreign key constraint to the year ID from the fact table to the year ID on the year dimension. So let's go ahead and execute that, and that is done. So let's come over here, right click and refresh, and you can see now we have our fact table. Now, for further clarification of this data mart design, what I'm going to do is just create a database diagram. And because we have foreign key constraints on our database design, on our data mart design, the database diagram will be created showing those foreign key relationships through using this tool. So I'm going to say create new database diagram. And I'm going to agree to this and say, do I wish to create this item? And I say yes. It'll bring up a little wizard here, and I'm going to add each of the dimensions to the design space of the diagram. Add the year. We're not going to add the staging table because the staging table itself is not part of our design for our data mart. It's simply a table that will be working with data as we populate our data mart. So I'm going to click close at this point, and notice here that the data mart is diagrammed. And here you can see the hierarchy off of the fact table. So we've got the city ID associated here with the city ID of foreign key constraint to the dimension of the city. And then we have yet another relationship, foreign key relationship, established between the city dimension and the state dimension through the state ID. Down below, we have the year ID attached to the year ID with a foreign key constraint right here in our year ID within the fact table. So that's how we complete our data mart design. And in the next video, we'll go to building the ETL package using SQL Server Integration Services to populate the data.